Fire swallowed the bakery at 2 in the morning. Celeste stood across the street, watching the flames crawl up every single brick she had wiped clean with her own hands, day after day. The glass shattered. The awning collapsed. Months of scraping together every penny, building from nothing, pouring sweat into every corner gone in one night. But Celeste was not crying for the shop. She was crying because inside it was her grandmother's handwritten recipe book, its spine worn thin, its edges curled, every page stained with faint traces of flour from her grandmother's hands, more than 20 years ago. It was the last thing connecting her to her family, and now it was burning. 3 hours later, Celeste sat in her small room, eyes swollen, hands still shaking when the door opened. A man stepped in. No knock, no words. He set something on the table. A book, blackened with smoke, edges singed, but every page intact. That man was Reed Calloway, the most powerful figure in the city of Ashford. The name no one in town dared to speak after 10 at night, and also the man who had fallen in love with her all because of a box of pastries at a riverside market. But this story does not begin with the fire. It begins 4 months earlier, when Celeste Grant, 27 years old, penniless, homeless, alone, drove a beat-up car into Ashford. Every last hope she had fit inside a box of pastries on the passenger seat and a worn-out recipe book tucked beneath it. If this story touched you, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. There is a new one waiting for you every week. Celeste woke before the sky had fully turned to morning. Her neck was stiff from sleeping curled in the driver's seat all night, her back aching, and the cold that seeped through the car window seemed to have settled deep into her bones. She sat up slowly, rolled her neck in a few careful circles, then looked outside. The riverside flea market was just beginning to stir. A few vendors had already pulled out their carts, laying out fruit, worn clothing, and small odds and ends on tarps spread across the ground. Early morning in Ashford carried the scent of river water mixed with the faint, comforting aroma of coffee drifting from a small shop at the corner of the street. Celeste opened the pastry box on the passenger seat and counted again. 14 pieces. The last batch she had made from what little butter and flour remained in her bag. If she sold them all at $5 each, she would have $70, enough to buy ingredients for another batch, and perhaps, just perhaps, enough for a night in a motel where she could take a hot shower for the first time in 2 weeks. She stepped out of the car, lifted the box, and found an empty spot between a woman selling dried flowers and an old man arranging chipped ceramic pieces. She had no tarp, no table, no sign. Only a clean cardboard box with 14 neatly arranged pastries inside, and she stood behind it with hands that still carried the soft scent of vanilla. The morning passed slowly. A middle-aged woman stopped and bought 2, praised their taste, then bargained the price down to $3.50. Celeste agreed, because she needed the money now. A young couple bought one, ate it on the spot, then came back for another. By late morning, she had sold 6, leaving 8. The market was beginning to thin out. The woman with dried flowers had already packed up and gone. The old man selling ceramics quietly placed his items back into boxes. Celeste looked at the 8 remaining pastries and knew that standing there longer would not change anything. She decided to walk along the main street. Ashford had busier commercial streets far livelier than the flea market. Restaurants, coffee shops, bakeries with large glass windows and warm golden lights inside. Celeste thought that if she could persuade one of them to buy in bulk, even just a dozen or 15 at a time, she would have a steadier way to sell than standing outside waiting for passers-by. She stopped in front of an elegant restaurant on the main street. A polished brass sign, clear glass doors, and inside she could see dark wooden tables and carefully arranged hanging lights. Celeste drew in a deep breath and pushed the door open. A man in a suit stood behind the reception counter, looking her up and down, his gaze lingering on her dust-covered shoes and the cardboard box in her hands. Before she could speak, he shook his head. The restaurant did not accept goods from street vendors. Could she please leave? His voice was not exactly rude, yet the way he emphasized the words street vendor made Celeste feel as though she had been placed into a category where she did not belong. She nodded, said thank you even though there was nothing to thank him for, and turned to leave. She had just passed through the doorway when she nearly collided with a man entering. She stepped back, looked up, then had to tilt her head a little higher because he stood nearly a head taller than her. Broad shoulders, neatly cut black hair, a face carved in sharp angles as if by a blade, and cold gray eyes that held her in an unblinking gaze for 2 seconds. He did not move aside, did not step back. He simply stood there, and Celeste felt a strange sensation that the space around them had just tightened, as though the entire street were quietly making room for this man. Behind her, she heard hurried footsteps. The manager who had just dismissed her was now rushing toward the door. His voice completely changed. "Mr. Calloway, it is a pleasure to have you. Your usual table is ready." The man did not look at the manager. His eyes remained fixed on the box in Celeste's hands. "What are you selling?" His voice was low, even, like a man accustomed to asking and being answered. Celeste tightened her grip on the box slightly, yet her voice did not tremble. "Handmade pastries. A family recipe. I made them myself." He looked at her for another second, then opened the lid. He took one pastry, bit into it, chewing slowly. Then he stopped. His jaw went still. His eyes dropped to the piece in his hand, as if it had just told him something no one else could hear. 3 seconds passed. Then he swallowed, and everything on his face returned to normal so quickly that Celeste was not certain she had seen anything at all. "How much for the box?" $5 each, Celeste said. 8 pieces would be 40. He took out his wallet, counted 8 $10 bills, and placed them in her hand. $80 for 8 pastries priced at 5 each. Celeste looked at the money, then at him. "You have given too much. I cannot accept it." He had already turned to enter the restaurant, but paused at the doorway and glanced back at her over his shoulder. "You are pricing your work below its true value. Do not." Then he disappeared behind the glass door, and the manager hurried after him like a shadow. Celeste stood on the sidewalk, $80 in her hand, an empty box, and a strange feeling in her chest that she could not name. She did not know who that man was. She only knew that for the first time in a very long while, someone had looked at what she had made and told her it was worth more than she believed. Celeste sat on a stone bench by the river, her back resting against the cold, hard slats, watching the slow current move below. The $80 in her coat pocket felt heavier than any amount of money she had ever carried, not because it was a large sum, but because of the way she had come by it. She was still thinking about the gray-eyed man and his words when a figure stopped in front of her. A young man in a gray suit, with neatly combed hair and a black business card embossed with raised lettering in his hand. He introduced himself as Mr. Calloway's assistant and spoke briefly, in the manner of someone used to delivering instructions rather than making requests. His employer wanted to place an order for 30 pastries as a trial for weekend service at the restaurant. Delivery Friday morning, before 9 o'clock. If she agreed, she was to contact the number on the card to confirm. He set the black card down on the bench beside her, gave a small nod, then turned and walked away without waiting for her answer. Celeste picked up the card. On the front was the name of the restaurant, with the words Calloway Holdings printed beneath it. On the back was a phone number written by hand. She turned the card over and over between her fingers, and in her mind 2 voices rose at the same time. One saying this was an opportunity, the other asking what she had to make it happen. 30 pastries. She counted the money in her pocket, then added what she had earned at the market that morning. $103 altogether. She calculated quickly in her head. Flour, butter, eggs, vanilla, sugar, packaging. Enough ingredients for exactly 30 pastries if she did not eat for 2 days. No extra money, no margin, no chance to start over if even one batch went wrong. She rose from the bench and went straight to the nearest grocery store. Celeste bought each item one by one, weighing and measuring carefully, comparing the prices of the cheapest brands on the shelves. She chose the second cheapest butter because the cheapest one tasted flat, and she knew that Reed Calloway had tasted pastries made with good butter, and she could not give him something lesser. It was the first time she thought his name, and she reminded herself that this was an order, not a favor. He was buying her pastries because they were good, not because he pitied her. At least that was what she wanted to believe. The next problem was the kitchen. Celeste did not have one. She had an old car, a driver's seat in place of a bed, and a parking lot in place of a home. She spent the entire afternoon walking through the area around the flea market, asking every small diner and every coffee shop whether anyone rented kitchen space by the hour. Most of them shook their heads. One person directed her to an old church at the end of the street and said there was a community kitchen there, and sometimes they let people from the neighborhood use it. The church was small, its old brick walls covered in climbing vines, quiet and cool inside. Celeste found an elderly pastor arranging chairs in the fellowship room. She explained her situation and said she needed to use the kitchen for 2 days to complete the order. He looked at her, then at the heavy bags of ingredients in her hands, and finally nodded. She could use the kitchen from 6 o'clock in the evening until however late she needed, so long as she cleaned everything when she was done. Celeste thanked him 3 times, and the 3rd time he waved a hand and told her to go bake her pastries, instead of standing there thanking him. Celeste began at 6 o'clock that evening. The community kitchen was small, with only 1 old oven, 2 gas burners, and a long stainless steel table. She spread out her ingredients, opened her grandmother's recipe notebook at the corner of the table, the page for vanilla butter pastries already marked open, and set to work. She kneaded the dough by hand because there was no mixer. Her arms ached after the 5th batch, but she did not stop. She measured the butter 1 spoonful at a time, cracked the eggs 1 by 1, and stirred until the mixture turned smooth and fully blended. The smell of melting butter mixed with vanilla and filled the little kitchen. The old oven heated unevenly, so she had to turn the trays every 7 minutes to make the pastries bake evenly. She stood in front of the oven, looking through the glass, waiting on each batch, and every time she opened the oven and saw the pastries rise evenly, their tops golden and warm, she let out a quiet breath as though she had managed to make it past 1 more narrow step. The first night she worked until 2 o'clock in the morning and finished 12 pastries. She slept 3 hours on a bench in the church fellowship room, then woke at 5, went out to buy more eggs because she had miscalculated by 2, and came back to the kitchen. On the 2nd day, she did not go to the market, did not sell retail, did not earn 1 more dollar. She poured everything into those 30 pastries. By Thursday evening, 29 pastries were neatly packed in boxes. The final batch was still in the oven. Celeste sat on the kitchen floor with her back against a cabinet, her eyes drooping with exhaustion. Her stomach growled. She had not eaten since yesterday morning except for 1 discounted loaf of bread and 2 cups of water from the church tap. Then the oven bell rang. She stood, opened the oven, and there was the last batch, evenly golden, breathing out heat. 30 pastries. Enough. She packed everything into boxes, cleaned the kitchen until it looked exactly as it had when she arrived, and carried the pastries out to the car. She sat in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and looked at the 30 boxes stacked across the back seat and the floor of the car. She placed the recipe notebook in the compartment before her, ran her hand lightly over the worn cover, then closed her eyes. Tomorrow morning she would make the delivery. Tomorrow morning she would find out whether this gamble had been worth it. On Friday morning, Celeste delivered the 30 pastries to the restaurant at exactly 8:45. The manager who had once turned her away now stood behind the counter, watching her carry each box inside without saying a word, only nodding and signing the receipt. Reed's assistant counted the order, checked each box, then handed her an envelope. Inside was cash, the exact agreed amount, not $1 short and not $1 more. Celeste held the envelope, stepped out of the restaurant, and for the first time in many months, she felt that she had actually completed something, instead of merely trying to survive another day. She drove back to the parking lot near the flea market, where she had slept for the past several nights. Her body was demanding rest. 2 days of nonstop baking, almost no food, only a few hours of sleep on a church bench before rising again. Now that the order had been delivered, all her strength seemed to drain out of her at once, as though someone had pulled the plug. She turned off the engine, reclined the driver's seat, and fell asleep almost instantly. She did not know how long she slept. Perhaps 2 hours, perhaps 4. What woke her was the soft tapping on the driver's side window. 3 knocks, steady and patient, not hurried, yet not stopping either. Celeste opened her eyes, took a few seconds to remember where she was, then turned to look. Outside the window stood an older woman, perhaps past 60, with silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, a face lined with many wrinkles, yet eyes still sharp and fully awake. She wore a simple white blouse and carried a small paper bag in one hand. She looked at Celeste through the glass with an expression that was neither pity nor curiosity, but the look of someone who had seen enough in life to know when another person needed help. Celeste lowered the window halfway. "What do you need, ma'am?" The older woman smiled, her voice warm but practical. "My name is Margot. I live in this neighborhood. I've seen you sleeping in this parking lot these past few days. And last night I saw you baking in the church kitchen until late. You work hard. I can see that clearly." Celeste did not know what she was supposed to feel at the thought that someone had been watching her without her knowing. She tightened her hands around the steering wheel even though the car was no longer running. "What do you want?" Margot placed the paper bag on the edge of the half-open window, a sandwich loaf, and a bottle of orange juice. Eat first, then listen to me. Celeste looked at the bag, then at the woman. Every instinct of self-protection inside her wanted to refuse, but her stomach had been growling since yesterday, and the smell of bread coming through the paper bag made her swallow. She took it, murmured a quiet thank you, and bit into the sandwich while Margot stood outside the car waiting, patient as someone with nothing in the world to rush toward. When Celeste had eaten half the sandwich, Margot finally continued. I have a small apartment behind the estate at the end of the street. There is a spare room there, clean, with a bed and a little kitchen. I'm old now, and I've lived alone these past few years. Sometimes I wouldn't mind having someone to talk to in the morning. If you need a place to stay, I rent it out cheap, $200 a month, with utilities included. Celeste stopped chewing. $200 a month in Ashford was almost the same as giving it away. Why are you being kind to me? I don't even know you. Margot shrugged. I don't know you either, but I do know what it looks like when someone is trying as hard as they can, and no one has yet reached out a hand. I saw you sleeping in the car with the doors still locked, your things neatly arranged, the church kitchen scrubbed clean after you used it. You're not the careless sort. That's all I need to know. Celeste sat still for a while. She was used to managing on her own, turning, adjusting, enduring, carrying it all herself. Accepting help from a stranger was not something she was good at, but she also knew that her body was at its limit. Her back ached from sleeping in the car seat. Her hands were sore from kneading dough for 2 days straight, and if another order came, she would need a real kitchen, not a borrowed church kitchen by the hour. May I see the room first? Margot nodded, as though Celeste had said exactly what she had hoped to hear. Come with me. The small apartment stood behind a large mansion at the end of the street, set apart by a little yard with several potted plants. Margot opened the door, and Celeste stepped inside. The room was small but clean. There was a real bed with white sheets, a little kitchen with enough space for an oven and 2 gas burners, and a window overlooking the yard. It was not spacious. It was not elegant, but it was enough. Enough to sleep properly, enough to bake, enough to let her breathe. Celeste turned to Margot. I'll take it. I can pay the first month right now. She took money from the envelope she had received that morning, counted out $200, and placed it in the woman's hand. Margot took the money, folded it, slipped it into her pocket, and did not count it. You should rest. There is tea and sugar in the kitchen cabinet. Help yourself. I'm right next door, so if you need anything, knock. When Margot closed the door behind her, Celeste stood in the middle of the little room, looking at the real bed with its white sheets, and she felt her throat tighten. She set her backpack on the floor, placed the recipe notebook on the bedside table, then sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress sank softly beneath her, clean and forgiving. She lay down, drew her legs up, and curled onto the first real bed she had known in 4 months. She did not have time to pull up the blanket. She did not have time to turn off the light. She fell asleep immediately, deep and quiet, for the first time without jolting awake at the sound of cars in the parking lot or headlights sweeping across the windows in the middle of the night. Celeste woke at 4 o'clock on Saturday morning, and for the first time in many months, she woke in a real bed and felt that her body had truly rested. She stretched, feeling that her back no longer ached the way it had through all those nights spent sleeping in the car, and she went straight to work. The order of 30 pastries had been delivered the day before, but Reed's assistant had called that afternoon and said the restaurant wanted another round for the weekend, the same quantity, to be delivered Monday morning. Celeste used the little kitchen in her rented room, smaller than the church kitchen but hers, a space she could use whenever she wished without having to ask anyone's permission. She baked all through Saturday and Sunday, each batch packed neatly into boxes, and on Monday morning she drove to the restaurant and made the delivery at exactly 8:30. Afterward, she drove back, and on the way through the neighborhood where she now lived, she slowed when she saw a familiar sight. Margot was standing in the front yard of the large mansion at the end of the street, watering the plants only a few dozen steps from Celeste's apartment. Celeste had seen this mansion every day since moving in, but she had never seen Margot there. She had always thought Margot lived in the apartment next to hers, because that was what the older woman had told her when she rented her the room. Celeste pulled over to the curb, lowered the window, and waved. Margot looked up, broke into a broad smile, waved back, then motioned for her to come in. Come inside and have some tea. I've just made a fresh pot. Celeste turned off the engine, stepped through the low iron gate, and followed the stone path into the front yard of the mansion. The house was large, 2 stories, painted white, with a gray roof and wide windows. She did not ask why Margot was watering plants there, because perhaps she worked for the owner, and there was nothing unusual about that for an older woman in a neighborhood like this. Margot led her into the kitchen through the back door. The kitchen was large and spotless, utensils hanging in careful order from their rack, a commercial stove, and a double-door refrigerator. Margot poured tea into 2 white porcelain mugs, pushed one toward Celeste, then sat down across from her. The 2 of them spoke gently. Margot asked whether the delivery had gone smoothly, whether she had slept well, whether the little kitchen in the rented room had been enough for her needs. Celeste answered each question, and she found herself at ease speaking with the older woman. Margot had the kind of way of listening that made a person want to say more, not because she was curious, but because she truly cared about the answer. Then Celeste looked up at the refrigerator. On one door, held in place by a small magnet shaped like a fish, was a photograph. It had been taken at some kind of party. Warm yellow lights glowing above, a banquet table in the background. In the photograph was Margot, dressed in formal black, standing beside a man. Celeste recognized him at once. Broad shoulders, black hair, a sharply carved face, gray eyes looking straight into the camera. Reed Calloway. In the photograph, he was smiling, a small smile that Celeste had never seen on his face in real life, and his hand rested on Margot's shoulder in the way people rest a hand on the shoulder of someone they consider family. Celeste set down her teacup. "You know Reed Calloway." Margot did not startle. She did not fumble. She followed Celeste's gaze, saw the photograph, then looked back at her, her voice still calm, as if they were speaking of the weather. "I am his housekeeper. I have been for 8 years. This mansion belongs to him, and the apartment you are renting belongs to him too." Celeste felt the blood rush to her face. She placed both hands on the table, her fingers tightening. Everything came together in her mind, with the speed of a light being switched on. Margot had appeared at the exact moment when she was at her most exhausted. A room for $200 a month in the most expensive neighborhood in Ashford. The way Margot had known she was sleeping in the car without ever having known her, it was all Reed. He had seen her sleeping in the car, he had sent Margot to her, he had arranged a place for her to stay, and he had done it all without letting her know. Just as he had bought all her pastries and paid double. Just as he had placed an order for 30 pastries after tasting them only once. He had been directing her life from behind the scenes while she had not even known it. "Why?" Celeste asked, her voice lower than usual. "Why would he do that? I did not ask anyone for help. I did not ask anyone to pity me." Margot took a sip of tea, set down her cup, and looked directly into Celeste's eyes. "He did tell me to rent you the room, yes, but I agreed because I wanted to, not because he told me to. I am old, and I like having someone to talk to in the mornings. As for why he did it, you should ask him. I only know that in the 8 years I have worked here, he has never once told me to go find someone to help. You are the first." Celeste sat in silence. The anger inside her did not disappear. It was still there, burning low and steady. She did not like being arranged. She did not like the feeling of someone standing behind her, pulling at the threads of her life, even with good intentions. But she also could not deny that the room had given her the first real sleep she had known in 4 months, and that little kitchen had allowed her to complete the second order without having to beg for the use of the church kitchen. She looked at Margot, then at the photograph on the refrigerator. Reed Calloway was smiling in that picture, but even that smile looked like something he was unaccustomed to doing. She kept that detail in mind, not in order to thank him, but in order to understand. Reed Calloway was a man who controlled everything from behind the curtain without showing his face. And Celeste needed to know why he had chosen to take control of her life. On Friday afternoon that week, Reed's assistant called Celeste. His voice was still as brief as it had been the first time they met by the stone bench along the river. The 30 pastries had sold out on the very first morning. Customers had asked for more, but there were none left. Mr. Calloway wanted to meet with her the following Monday at the main restaurant, at 9 o'clock in the morning, to discuss a long-term supply contract. Celeste ended the call, sat on the edge of the bed in her small room, and looked at the recipe notebook lying on the bedside table. 2 weeks earlier, she had still been sleeping in her car with $47 in her pocket. Now she was being invited to sign a contract to supply pastries to a restaurant chain. She still did not completely believe it, but she knew she had no right not to believe it, because this was the very thing she had gambled 2 hungry days to gain. On Monday morning, Celeste arrived at the restaurant at exactly 9 o'clock. This time she was led straight into a small room in the back, with a dark wooden table, 2 chairs, and a contract already laid out on the tabletop. Reed was already there. He wore a black shirt without a jacket, the sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. He nodded in greeting when she stepped inside. He did not rise, did not offer his hand, only motioned for her to sit in the chair across from him. The meeting was brief. Reed said he wanted Celeste to supply 200 pastries each week for the 3 restaurants owned by Callaway Holdings. The price for each pastry would be set by her, and he would not bargain. So that she could produce enough quantity, he would allow her to use the kitchen of the main restaurant outside business hours, from 5 o'clock until 10 o'clock each morning. The contract would run for 6 months, and renew automatically if both parties agreed. Celeste picked up the contract and read it line by line. Reed sat still and waited. He did not rush her, did not add any further explanation, as though he was accustomed to making an offer and allowing people to decide for themselves. When Celeste finished reading, she folded the contract closed and said she would take it home, read it one more time, and sign it the following morning. Reed looked at her, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but close to one. Good. You are careful. That is good. Then he stood and walked out of the room, and the meeting ended in less than 15 minutes. That night, Celeste sat on the bed and read through the contract for the 3rd time beneath the light of the table lamp. Every term was clear. There was nothing hidden. The use of the kitchen was free of charge. The supply price was hers to decide. There was no exclusivity clause. She could still sell elsewhere if she wanted. She signed her name on the last page, folded the contract, and the next morning brought it to the restaurant and handed it to the assistant. From that day on, Celeste began each morning at 4:30. She drove to the restaurant, opened the back door with a key that had been issued only to her, and stepped into the large kitchen while all of Ashford was still buried in darkness. The restaurant kitchen was entirely different from the church kitchen or the little one in her rented room. It was wide, bright, fitted with industrial ovens that heated evenly, a professional mixer, and a long stainless steel table with enough room for her to lay out 40 boxes at once. Celeste worked there alone in silence, and she felt that she belonged in this place, between the scent of melting butter and the steady sound of the mixer, more than in any other place she had known in the 4 months of wandering. During the first week, Reed did not appear. In the second week, one morning while Celeste was waiting for a batch in the oven, she heard footsteps near the back door. Reed entered the kitchen at 5:15, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He did not greet her, only gave a small nod, then sat on the high stool in the corner of the kitchen, drank his coffee, and looked out the window. Celeste looked at him, then turned back to her work. Neither of them spoke during the first 10 minutes. Then Reed asked, his voice low and quiet in the empty kitchen, "Who taught you this recipe?" "My grandmother," Celeste answered without looking up from the dough she was kneading. "She taught me when I was 7 years old. She wrote every recipe by hand in a notebook, with little notes in the margins. Things like, add a little more salt if the air is damp, or use less sugar if the butter is salted." Reed did not ask anything more, but he did not leave either. He remained seated in the corner until Celeste took the batch from the oven. Then he rose, nodded once, and walked out of the kitchen as quietly as he had come in. In the mornings that followed, Reed appeared irregularly, sometimes 3 days in a row, sometimes not at all for a full week. But each time he came, he sat in that same chair in the corner of the kitchen, drank black coffee, and the two of them spoke a little. Never long, never deeply, only a few sentences between the sound of the oven and the scent of vanilla. Celeste spoke of her grandmother in fragments, not because she had set out to open her heart, but because while she was making pastries from her grandmother's recipes, the memories seemed to rise on their own. She told him that her grandmother used to sing while kneading dough, that she always wore a flowered apron, even after it had become worn and frayed, that she used to say baking was like writing a letter, each pastry a message meant for the one who ate it. Then one morning, for reasons she could not quite explain, Celeste spoke of her mother. Her mother had fallen into debt because of gambling and had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving behind debts that Celeste was still running from. When she finished speaking, she stopped, her hands no longer moving over the dough, suddenly aware that she had just said aloud something she had never told anyone in Ashford. She looked over at Reed. He was still sitting in the chair in the corner, the coffee cup in his hand, his eyes fixed on her without blinking. He did not offer comfort. He did not ask another question. He did not look at her with pity. He only looked at her with those gray eyes, still and deep. The kind of gaze that comes from someone who is truly listening and not merely pretending to. During that period, Celeste began to understand Reed through Margot. Not through anything the older woman said directly, but through the small details Celeste gathered by chance. One evening, Celeste went over to Margot's room for tea and noticed a new box of back pain medicine on the kitchen table, more expensive than the kind Margot usually used. Celeste asked if she had changed medicine. Margot looked at the box and shook her head. "I did not buy it. This morning it simply appeared on the table in place of the old one." She said nothing more, but both of them knew who had left it there. Another time, Margot told an old story while the two of them were sitting outside in the yard, enjoying the evening air. "The first year he bought the mansion," she said in a soft voice, as though remembering it for herself. "He slept on the living room floor for 3 months straight. I asked him why he did not sleep in the bed, and he said he was not used to it yet. But in the first week after I came to work for him, he bought a new bed for my room before he bought one for himself." Margot never said that Reed was a good man. She never praised him aloud, but every small story she told painted the portrait of a man who cared in his own way, quietly, without needing anyone to know, without needing anyone to thank him. 2 months had passed since Celeste signed the contract to supply pastries. 200 each week, steady, not one box missing. Customers from the 3 restaurants had begun asking for the name of the person who made them, and some sent word through the managers asking to place large private orders for birthday parties and company events. Celeste was beginning to understand that borrowing the restaurant kitchen by the hour would not be enough for long. She needed a place of her own. One morning, Reed came into the kitchen earlier than usual. He did not sit in the corner chair the way he always did, but instead laid a stack of papers on the stainless steel table beside where Celeste was kneading dough. A lease agreement, the ground floor of a building he owned on the commercial street, a good location, a wide storefront, with a kitchen already in place at the back. Celeste wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the contract to read it. She read slowly, line by line, exactly the way she had read the pastry supply contract before. When she reached the rent amount, she stopped. $1,200 a month for a commercial property in Ashford. She knew the market rate in that area. She had looked into it herself, because she was not the kind of person who waited for someone else to hand her everything. The market rate was at least double that amount. Celeste set the contract down on the table, took a pen from the pocket of her apron, drew a single line through the number 1,200, and wrote beside it 2,500. Then she signed her name at the bottom and pushed the contract back toward Reed. Reed looked at the crossed-out number, looked at the new amount, then looked at her. He said nothing. He took the pen, signed on the line beneath hers, folded the contract, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his shirt. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, so quickly that Celeste could not be certain she had truly seen it. Then he picked up his coffee, stood, and walked out of the kitchen. Celeste moved into the new space the following week. She scrubbed every floor tile, cleaned the walls, arranged the kitchen in the back, and repainted the wooden front door with her own hands. She hired no one. She asked no one for help. She worked alone for 4 straight days. When the shop was ready, she placed her grandmother's recipe notebook in the drawer beneath the front counter, where she could reach for it whenever she needed. She took photographs of the shop, posted them on social media, wrote a few simple lines of introduction, handmade pastries from a family recipe, and included the address. For the first 2 weeks, the shop was busy. People came out of curiosity, because they had seen the advertisement, because they had heard about it from friends. Many came back a second time, then a third. Celeste began to feel that she could breathe. For the first time in a very long while, she thought about the future without feeling afraid. Then, on Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week, 3 men walked into the shop. Celeste was standing behind the counter. There were still 2 customers seated at a table near the window. The 3 men entered together, 1 in front, 2 behind, and the way they moved was not the way customers came in to buy pastries. The one in front was tall, bald, and dressed in a leather jacket. He looked around the shop once, then fixed his eyes directly on Celeste. Celeste Grant, right. His voice was loud, not lowered in the slightest, and the 2 customers at the window table looked up. Celeste tightened her grip on the edge of the counter. She knew what this was. Not their faces. She did not know their faces. But she knew the manner of debt collectors. She had encountered it too many times since her mother died. The same loud voice, the same crushing stare meant to force another person down, the same question that was not a question. Your mother owed us $43,000. She is dead, but the debt remains. You are her only daughter. You pay it. Celeste drew in a deep breath. Her hands tightened on the counter until her knuckles turned white, but her voice did not shake. I know about my mother's debt. I will pay it when I am able, but you do not have the right to come here and make trouble in my place of business. The bald man laughed, the laugh of someone unaccustomed to being refused. He turned to the other two men and gave a nod. One of them stepped forward and shoved over the table nearest the counter. A chair flipped backward. A glass of water shattered across the floor. The two customers at the window table hurried to their feet and slipped out the door. The second man knocked over another table. Celeste stepped back once, her spine hitting the wall behind the counter. She was afraid. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat. But she did not run. She stood there, her back straight, her eyes fixed directly on the bald man. Then the space changed. Celeste did not hear the door open. She did not hear footsteps, but the bald man, who had been staring at her, suddenly stopped laughing. His eyes shifted past Celeste, then to the right, toward the entrance. The other two men turned their heads as well. All three of them went still, as if someone had pressed pause. Celeste turned to look. Reed was standing in the doorway of the shop. He did not come all the way inside. He only stood at the threshold, one hand in his pocket, one shoulder resting lightly against the frame. The posture was relaxed, as though he were waiting for someone to pour him a cup of coffee, and not standing there looking at three men who had just overturned the tables in her shop. But his gray eyes were not relaxed at all. They were cold, motionless, and fixed on the bald man without blinking. Reed did not shout. He did not strike anyone. He did not even take another step into the shop. He said only one sentence, his voice low and even, like a man reading an item from a menu. Celeste did not hear clearly what he said, because he spoke so softly that only those three men could hear it. But she saw their reaction. The bald man swallowed. The other two stepped back almost at the same moment. Then all three turned, moved quickly toward the door, passed by Reed without daring to look at him, and disappeared out onto the street. The shop fell silent. Tables and chairs lay overturned. Broken glass glittered across the floor. Celeste stood behind the counter, her hand still gripping the edge, her heart still hammering in her throat. She looked at Reed. He was still standing in the doorway, his hand still in his pocket, as if nothing at all had happened. "What did you say to them?" Celeste asked, her voice rougher than she wanted it to be. Reed looked at her for a moment, then answered, his tone light and calm. "My name." Reed remained standing in the doorway of the shop after the three men disappeared into the street. Celeste was still behind the counter, her hand no longer gripping the edge, yet she had not moved. Between them lay overturned tables and chairs, shards of broken glass glittering across the tile floor, and a question Celeste knew she could no longer postpone. "Who are you?" Celeste asked. It was not the voice of fear, nor the voice of anger, but the voice of someone who had endured too many surprises and needed the truth before she could continue. "The last time, you bought all of my pastries and paid double. Then you sent Margot to rent me a room. Then you let me use the kitchen, let me rent the shop. And just now, you walked in here, said one sentence, and three men larger than you ran as if they were being chased. You are not an ordinary businessman. So who are you?" Reed looked at her. He took his hand out of his pocket, stepped inside the shop, lifted one of the fallen chairs upright, and sat down. His movements were slow, unhurried, as though he were weighing each word before speaking. Then he looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers across the cluttered little shop. "I am the man no one in this city wants a problem with, and from now on, neither are you." He offered no further explanation. He did not name an organization, did not tell details, did not defend himself. Just that one sentence. And it was enough for Celeste to understand what she needed to understand. Reed Calloway did not merely own restaurants and real estate. He owned something money could not buy in the usual way, the fear of other people. She thought of the way the restaurant manager's attitude had changed the moment he saw him, the way his assistant delivered orders rather than requests, the way this entire town seemed to orbit around him, without his needing to speak a single word. Celeste should have been afraid. She knew she should have been afraid. The rational part of her mind told her to thank him for his help, then walk out the door, drive away from Ashford, and never come back. But she stood there looking at Reed sitting on that chair in the middle of her wrecked shop, and she saw something she had not expected. He was sitting there alone, in that empty bakery, in the late afternoon light, and he looked lonely. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from lacking friends or lacking a lover. It was the loneliness of someone who had sat alone for so long that he had forgotten he might sit beside another person. Celeste recognized it because she knew that kind of loneliness. She had lived with it through 4 months in the old car, through the 2 years since her mother died, through her whole life since her father walked away. It looked different on Reed's face, colder, harder, but beneath the outer shell it was exactly the same. She did not leave. She bent down, picked up the broken pieces of glass from the floor, and began to clean the shop. A week passed. The debt collectors did not come back. There were no phone calls, no messages, no one appearing at the door of the bakery. Celeste waited every day. Each time she heard the bell above the shop door ring open, she looked up. But it was only customers buying pastries. By the 8th day, she began to doubt. Debt collectors were not the kind who gave up easily. She knew that from 2 years of being chased. They did not stop simply because one man had spoken his name in a doorway, unless something else had happened that she did not know about. That evening, Celeste went over to Margot's room for tea. She asked directly, "Do you know what happened to the debt collectors?" Margot set down her teacup, looked at Celeste for a moment as though weighing how much she ought to say, then told her. Reed had someone verify the debt her mother owed. The original amount her mother had borrowed was $14,000. But the loan sharks had inflated it to $43,000 through savage interest and penalty fees, stacked on top of penalty fees. Reed paid the exact $14,000, the lawful principal, and sent a lawyer to inform them that the rest was fraud, and that if they ever came back to look for Celeste, they would have a problem with him. Margot finished speaking and went on drinking her tea, calm as though she had just described the weather. Celeste set her cup down harder than she meant to. She stood, thanked Margot, then went straight to the mansion. She knocked on the door. Once, twice, 3 times, harder each time. Reed opened it, still wearing a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, as though he had never once learned how to rest. He looked at her, saw the flush in her face, saw the brightness in her eyes from anger, and tilted his head slightly to one side in the manner of a man who had known this conversation would come. "You had no right to pay my debt without asking me," Celeste said, her voice controlled, though it trembled at the end of the sentence. "I did not ask you. I did not beg you. That was my mother's debt. It is my responsibility, and you stepped into it, without saying one word to me." Reed stood in the doorway, neither stepping back nor forward, his eyes fixed on hers without blinking. Then he spoke, his voice still as low and even as always, but slower now, as though he were choosing each word more carefully than usual. "I did not pay it for you. The inflated part was fraud. I only erased that. The lawful principal, $14,000, you owe to me. Pay it whenever you want." Celeste stood still. She had prepared 10 things to say to him, but his answer cut off 9 of them. He had not given her money. He had transferred the debt from the loan sharks to himself, on the condition that she could repay it whenever she wished, which meant no interest, no fees, no deadline. He had turned the debt from a crushing burden into something Celeste could actually control. But she was still angry. Not because he had done wrong, but because he had done right in a way that left her with no argument, and she hated that feeling. "I want you to write down the exact amount, $14,000. I will repay every dollar, and I will repay it on my schedule, not when you tell me to." Celeste said it with a hard voice, her eyes fixed directly on his. Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, one slow nod, without arguing, without further explanation. "Fine." Celeste turned and walked away, and after she had taken a few steps, she heard the door close behind her, softly, not slammed. She did not turn back, but she knew that what had just happened was the first real disagreement between her and Reed. And it was also the first time she had seen Reed Calloway, the man whose name no one in the city dared speak after 10 o'clock at night, yield to anyone. That person had been her. 2 weeks after the night, Celeste stood at the mansion door and demanded that Reed write down the exact amount of the debt. Everything remained calm in a way she was not yet used to. The bakery was busy every day. She had begun to recognize the faces of regular customers, to know who loved the classic vanilla butter cakes, who came only for cinnamon pastries every Saturday morning, who bought in large quantities for the office at the start of each week. By the time she finished cleaning the shop in the evening, night had already fallen. She would walk back to the little room behind the mansion, cook herself a bowl of noodles or warm up whatever food Margot had left aside for her, then sit on the bed reading through the recipe notebook again, planning for the next day. Ashford was beginning to feel like a place where she belonged, and that feeling unsettled Celeste more than anything else, because she had learned that whenever she started to feel safe somewhere, that was usually the moment when everything was about to fall apart. On Thursday night of that week, Celeste closed the bakery later than usual because she had to prepare dough for the order due the next morning. When she stepped outside, the street was already quiet. She normally took the main road home, but tonight she was tired. Her legs were heavy, and the shortcut alley behind the shop would save her 5 minutes. She turned into the alley and walked quickly between 2 high brick walls. The streetlights did not reach this place. There was only the dim glow of a single lamp fixed to the wall at the far end. She heard the sound before she saw anything. A car door opening, footsteps, low voices that were quiet but clear. Celeste stopped. Instinct told her to hold still before her eyes had even fully adjusted. At the end of the alley, beneath the weak light, a black car was parked sideways, its rear door open. 2 men were being pulled out of it by 3 others. Celeste recognized one of the 3 escorts. She had seen him once at Reed's mansion, walking across the yard when she was on her way to Margot's room. The 2 men being dragged from the car did not shout, did not cry out, but the look on their faces beneath the dim lamp made Celeste feel as though she might be sick. Fear, not the fear of someone caught off guard, but the fear of someone who knew exactly what was waiting and understood there was no way out. One of the 2 was shaking so badly that his knees buckled, and he had to be hauled upright. There was no blood, no screaming, no visible violence. But the atmosphere in that alley was so heavy that Celeste felt she could not breathe. She took 1 step backward. Her shoe struck an empty soda can on the ground, and it rolled away with a small metallic rattle. One of the 3 escorts turned his head toward her. Celeste froze in the darkness. Her heart pounded in her temples. The man looked in her direction for 2 seconds, then turned back and shoved the 2 others through an iron door set into the side wall. The door closed. The alley was empty. Celeste turned and went back toward the main street, walking fast, then almost running. She did not stop until she reached her room, closed the door, and locked it. She sat down on the floor with her back against the door, her arms around her knees, breathing hard. She closed her eyes, but she could still see the faces of those 2 men, the terror on them, the way one man's legs had given out beneath him, and she thought of Reed, his quiet gray eyes when he sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, the slow nod when he had given in to her the other night, the way he replaced Margot's back medicine without saying a word. Then she thought of the alley, his men, his car, and 2 human beings so frightened that they no longer had the strength even to cry out. Celeste opened her eyes, stood up, and began packing her things. She did not have much. A backpack with clothes, toiletries, a little cash. She slipped the recipe notebook into the innermost pocket of the bag, wrapped carefully in plastic to keep it safe. She swung the backpack over her shoulder and opened the door to step out. The narrow passage connecting her room to Margot's was silent, but just as Celeste passed, Margot's door opened. Margot stood there in her nightclothes, her silver hair loose, her eyes narrowed against the hallway light. She looked at the backpack on Celeste's shoulder and understood at once without needing to ask. But she still asked, her voice gentle, without blame, without trying to stop her. "Where are you going at this hour?" Celeste looked at her, and her throat tightened. Margot had given her a place to stay, had given her breakfast, had told her old stories over evening tea. She had nothing to do with what happened in that dark alley, but she lived in the house of the man who gave the orders for such things to happen. Celeste did not answer her question. She stepped forward and hugged her. A brief embrace, but a tight one. Then let go, turned, and walked toward the door. Outside, Reed was standing there. He stood on the narrow path leading out into the yard, his hands not in his pockets, his shoulder not resting against the wall. None of the false ease he had worn the day he stood in the bakery doorway when the debt collectors came. He stood straight, looking at her, and Celeste knew someone had told him. Perhaps the man in the alley had recognized her. Perhaps a camera had caught her. Perhaps Margot had called him while Celeste was still holding her. It did not matter. What mattered was that he stood there, yet he did not block her way. He stood to one side, The path out to the yard was still open. The mansion gate was still open. Her old car was still parked out on the street. If she wanted to leave, she could leave. Reed spoke, his voice lower and slower than usual, like a man saying the most important thing he knew she might not want to hear. If you go, I won't stop you. But I want you to know this. Those two men traffic illegal goods in residential neighborhoods. I have lines, Celeste. You haven't seen all of them yet, but they exist. Celeste stood in the middle of the path with the backpack on her shoulder, looking at Reed, then back toward the little room through the open door where Margot was still standing in the doorway, then out toward the road ahead, dark and long and leading to whatever place she did not yet know. The backpack weighed on her shoulder. The night wind was cold. She thought of 4 months earlier, when she had driven into Ashford with $47 and a box of pastries. She thought of the mornings in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and flour, and the gray eyes watching her without blinking when she spoke of her grandmother. She thought of the dark alley and the terrified faces of the two men. All of it was Reed. All of it belonged to the same man. Celeste lowered the backpack to the ground, not because she trusted him completely, not because she accepted his world, but because she decided that she would understand him for herself before she judged him. She would stay long enough to learn whether the lines he spoke of were real or not, and if they were not, she would leave. But she would leave because she had seen enough, not because she had run away. She looked at Reed. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke another word. Celeste picked up the backpack, but instead of slinging it over her shoulder, she carried it back toward her room. As she passed Margot, the older woman said nothing, only placed a hand on Celeste's shoulder for 1 second, and then let it fall away. Celeste went inside, closed the door, set the backpack on the floor, and sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not sleep that night, but she stayed. In the days after that night, Celeste remained in Ashford, but she drew back into herself the way a snail retreats into its shell. She still woke at 4:30, still drove to the restaurant kitchen, still baked exactly 200 pastries each week, still opened the shop on time, and closed it on time. But when Reed appeared in the kitchen on those early mornings, Celeste did not talk the way she once had. She nodded in greeting, answered if he asked something, but she did not volunteer stories, did not begin conversations, did not look at him for long. She built an invisible wall between them, and Reed seemed to understand, because he did not try to break it down. He still came, still sat in the chair in the corner of the kitchen, still drank black coffee, but he did not ask why she had grown quieter, did not ask what she had seen that night, did not try to explain or justify anything. He gave her space, and Celeste did not know whether that made her feel lighter or more irritated, because it would have been much easier if he had tried to force her to speak. Then she would have had a reason to be angry. 3 weeks passed that way. Celeste threw herself completely into the bakery. She began trying new recipes from her grandmother's notebook. Honey almond cakes that her grandmother used to make in the fall. Lemon cream pastries that, according to her grandmother's notes, had to cool completely before cutting, or the filling would never set the right way. The customers loved them. The orders increased. And Celeste began thinking about hiring someone to help. She was so busy that she almost managed to forget the image of the two frightened faces in the dark alley. Almost. Then came that morning. Celeste entered the restaurant kitchen at 4:45, earlier than usual because she needed to prepare a large order for a weekend party. She switched on the lights, opened the oven, laid out the ingredients across the work table, and began kneading dough. 20 minutes later, she heard the back door open. Familiar footsteps, heavy but not loud. Reed stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. He set 1 cup at the corner of the table, near where Celeste was working, then carried the other back to the chair in the corner of the kitchen, earlier than usual. Celeste looked at the cup of coffee he had left for her, then looked at him. He sat in the chair, drank his coffee, stared out at the dark window, and said nothing. Celeste turned back to the dough, her hands pressed into the soft mass, folded it over, pressed it out again, folded it again, a steady rhythm her body had known by heart since she was 7 years old. She kneaded for 5 minutes, then stopped without warning. She did not know why she did what she did next. Perhaps because 3 weeks of silence had been long enough. Perhaps because he kept bringing her coffee every morning even though she had not once said thank you. Perhaps because she was tired of having to stay guarded every second. She turned to the side table, took the spare apron hanging from the wall hook, and walked straight to where Reed was sitting. She held the apron out to him. Reed looked at the apron in her hand, then looked up at her face, his gray eyes narrowing slightly in confusion. Need, she said, her voice brief, offering no explanation. Reed set down his coffee cup. He took the apron and looked at it as though he were studying an object from another world. The apron was white, with small flowers along the trim, marked with faint smudges of flour from many uses. Reed Calloway, the man whose name the entire city of Ashford would not speak after 10 o'clock at night, stood in a restaurant kitchen at 5 in the morning, awkwardly trying to tie on a flowered apron whose strings were too short for his frame. He managed to knot it behind his back on the third attempt, and when he turned around to face Celeste, the sight of him was so strange that it almost felt unreal. Broad shoulders, a sharply cut face, cold gray eyes, and a white flowered apron. Celeste led him to the dough table and placed a lump of dough in front of him. Press down, fold it over, turn it a quarter, press again. Repeat. She demonstrated once, the motion smooth and light. Reed watched, nodded, then placed both hands on the dough. He pressed too hard, and the dough flattened onto the table. He tried to fold it over, but it stuck to his fingers, and when he pulled his hand away, the dough followed in long, sticky strands. He tried to keep kneading, but the more he worked it, the more it clung. To the table, to his hands, to his wrists, and somehow even to his face, a streak of white flour stretching from his left cheekbone to his temple. Reed looked down at his hands covered in sticky white dough, then looked at Celeste with the expression of a man who had just lost a battle he had not remotely prepared for. Celeste laughed, not a polite laugh, not a little smile, not the sort of quiet laugh behind her hand that she gave when customers praised her pastries. She laughed for real, the sound rising out of her chest, through her throat, filling the empty kitchen at 5 in the morning, striking the brick walls, and coming back again. It was the laughter of someone who had forgotten she was still capable of laughing like that. She laughed because Reed Calloway was standing there with flour on his face, a flowered apron on his body, and both hands raised in helpless surrender as he stared at the dough clinging stubbornly between his fingers. She laughed until tears came to her eyes and she had to brace herself against the edge of the stainless steel table to keep her knees from giving way. Reed stopped kneading, his hands dropped to his sides, and bits of dough fell in soft flecks to the floor. He did not look at the dough anymore. He looked at Celeste. He looked at her laughing, looked at her eyes squeezed shut with laughter, looked at her shoulders shaking, looked at the way she used the back of her flour-covered hand to wipe the tears from her cheeks, and he stood still. In that empty kitchen at 5 in the morning, with flour on his face, the smell of cooling coffee on the table, the bright white fluorescence shining overhead, and Celeste's laughter ringing through the quiet space, Reed knew that he had fallen in love, not because she was strong, though she was, not because she was brave, though she was, not because she was beautiful, though she was beautiful in a way that flour on her hands and shadows beneath her eyes from lack of sleep could not hide. He loved her because of that laughter, because it was something he had never had in his life. No one had ever laughed in a kitchen at 5 in the morning with him. No one had ever looked at him being clumsy and laughed instead of being afraid. No one had ever handed him a flowered apron and told him to knead as though he were an ordinary man and not Reed Calloway. He said nothing. He only stood there and watched her laugh. And for the first time in his life, someone else's smile made his chest ache, a kind of pain that was not injury, but the pain of something far too large, suddenly taking up space inside him before he even knew what name to give it. After that morning, the invisible wall Celeste had kept standing for 3 weeks began to crack. She did not mean to break it down, and Reed did not try to, but the cracks spread anyway in the way some things do when neither person can quite control them anymore. Celeste began talking again when Reed appeared in the kitchen. Not as much as before, but enough that the space no longer felt suffocating in its silence. She did not ask him about the alley, and he did not mention the night she had almost left. They spoke like two people learning how to stand near each other again, after discovering just how wide the true distance between them had been. And Reed began to show something that took Celeste a while to recognize. He took care of her, but in his own way, which meant he never said it aloud and never accepted credit for it. One morning, Celeste came into the kitchen to find that the mixer that had broken the night before was gone. She had expected to knead all 200 pastries by hand the way she had in the beginning, but when she stepped inside, a brand new mixer stood exactly where the old one had been, still wrapped in paper, unopened by anyone. She looked around. No one was there. She called the restaurant manager to ask, and he said he knew nothing about it. She knew it was Reed. A week later, her butter supplier delivered a poor batch, bland and watery, unusable for baking. She was about to call and complain, but the next morning the supplier contacted her first, apologized, sent a replacement batch, and gave her a 10% discount for the next 3 months. Celeste knew butter did not improve its own quality, and suppliers did not reduce their prices out of sudden kindness. She did not ask Reed, and he did not mention it. Then one evening, Celeste came down with a cold. She closed the shop 2 hours early, went back to her room, boiled ginger water to drink, and fell asleep on top of the bed fully dressed, because she was too tired to change. The next morning she dragged herself to the bakery at 6 o'clock, her nose blocked, her eyes red, her head heavy as stone. On the front steps, just outside the door, sat a paper bag. Inside was a box of cold medicine, a packet of honey lemon tea, and a cup of chicken soup still warm beneath its tightly sealed lid. There was no note, no name. Celeste picked up the cup of soup, and the heat passed through her palms. She sat on the bakery steps and drank it in small sips in the early morning light. She did not cry, but her eyes stung more than usual, and she blamed the cold. 2 weeks after the morning, Celeste laughed in the kitchen. One late evening, she was cleaning the bakery when Reed came in. He did not enter through the front door, but through the back, from the kitchen side, the way he always did. The shop was already closed. The lights in the front had been turned off, and only the kitchen light remained. Celeste was wiping down the stainless steel table when she heard his footsteps and looked up. Reed sat down on the chair in the corner of the kitchen. Not the chair in the restaurant, but the tall stool where he always sat on those early mornings. He was not holding coffee. He did not say why he had come. He just sat there in silence and watched Celeste wiping the table. Celeste finished, wrung out the cloth, hung it on the hook, then turned back to look at him. Something was different in his face tonight. Not coldness, not control. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something very high, trying to decide whether to jump. Celeste pulled over a chair and sat across from him, about an arm's length away. She did not ask anything. She only sat there and waited, because she had learned that with Reed, waiting worked better than asking. Reed looked down at his hands, large hands resting on his thighs, fingers slightly curved. Then he spoke, his voice deeper than usual, slower than usual, like a man opening a door that had been locked for a very long time and whose hinges had already rusted. I grew up in foster care. Celeste did not move. She looked at him and waited. My mother left me there when I was a few months old. She did not leave a name. She did not leave anything. I grew up there until I was 16. He stopped for a moment, as though each sentence was a heavy stone he had to lift before he could set down the next one. No one wanted to take me. Some families came to looked at me, then chose another child instead. I do not know why. Maybe because I did not smile enough. Maybe because I looked at them as if I were judging them instead of begging them to choose me. I was not treated kindly there. I learned to protect myself very early because no one protected me. I learned that if I did not want to be hurt, I had to become the kind of person no one would dare hurt. He lifted his eyes to Celeste. They were not red, not wet, but inside those gray eyes was something Celeste had never seen before, like ice across the surface of a lake, splitting open to reveal water beneath so deep it had no bottom. When I was 8, he continued, his voice softer now, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. Someone left a piece of cake outside my room. Early in the morning, I opened the door and found it there on a paper plate. No note. I never knew who left it. That day was my birthday. But I was never sure whether the person who left it knew that. Maybe it was only a coincidence. But it was the only time in my life I ever received something that came with no condition. No one asked me to behave better, to say thank you, to give something back in return. It was just a piece of cake, sitting outside my door. For me, he looked at Celeste. That day at the flea market, when I bit into your pastry, the smell carried me straight back to that morning, to that exact paper plate, to that exact scent of butter and vanilla. It had been 25 years since I remembered that smell, until I picked up your pastry. Celeste sat still. She thought of the 3 silent seconds when Reed tasted her pastry outside the restaurant, the way his eyes had changed and then gone back to normal. Now she understood what those 3 seconds had been. Reed added one more thing, his voice almost a whisper. I taught myself not to cry when I was 10, because crying did not change anything. He did not explain more. He did not say why it had been 10. He did not describe what had happened. Only that one sentence, and Celeste understood that it was already far more than Reed had ever said to anyone. Celeste did not offer comfort. She did not say I understand because she knew she did not understand all of it. She did not say I am sorry because she was not the one who had done those things to him. She only reached out and placed her hand over his, her small hand resting on the back of his larger one, and she sat there in silence, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Reed looked at her hand on top of his. He did not pull his hand away. He did not close his fingers around hers. He simply let it remain there, and the two of them sat that way in the kitchen of the bakery, lights still on, the scent of butter and vanilla lingering faintly in the walls, the steady ticking of the clock hanging nearby. No one said another word, and no one needed to. It was everything Reed needed. Someone sitting beside him in silence, without being afraid of him, without pitying him, without demanding that he explain more. Just there. Only that. A few days after the evening Reed told her about the orphanage, Celeste realized that everything between them had changed in a way that could not be undone. Before that night, she had been able to tell herself that Reed was only her landlord, her business partner, the man who had helped her when she was struggling, and that one day she would pay off every debt and they would stand on equal ground. But after that night, after he had opened the door, he had kept locked for 25 years and allowed her to look inside, Celeste knew this was no longer about debt or kindness. She had seen the most human part of him, the part he kept hidden behind those cold gray eyes, and the name the whole city feared, and she could no longer pretend that she felt nothing. But Celeste was not a woman who ran from the truth. She felt something for Reed. That much she admitted to herself in the nights when she lay awake staring at the ceiling. But that feeling came with fear, not fear of him, but fear of the world he lived in. She had seen the dark alley. She had seen the way 3 large men ran just from hearing his name. She knew Reed had lines. He had told her so. But she still did not fully know what those lines were drawn with in a world like his. And Celeste had already lost too much in life not to understand that loving someone without looking straight at the truth would only cost her more. On Tuesday evening, the bakery closed at 6 o'clock. Celeste stayed behind to clean, wiping the tables, stacking the chairs, sweeping the floor. She was wiping down the last table near the window when she heard the back door open. Familiar footsteps. She did not turn, because she knew who it was. Reed stepped into the kitchen, but instead of sitting in the corner chair the way he always did, he walked straight out into the front of the bakery where Celeste was standing. He stopped in the doorway between the kitchen and the customer area, his hands not in his pockets, his shoulders not resting against the wall. He stood straight and looked at her, and Celeste saw on his face the same expression she had seen the night he told her about the orphanage, the look of a man standing at the edge of something very high who had already decided to jump. Celeste stopped wiping the table, straightened, and looked at him. The two of them stood about 4 steps apart in the empty bakery, with the pale gold of evening light falling through the glass windows, the chairs already arranged upside down on the tables, and the scent of butter and vanilla still hanging in the air. Reed spoke. No introduction, no circling around it, no asking permission. His voice was low and even, but slower than usual, like a man speaking words he had rehearsed in his head many times and never once said aloud. From the day you stood outside my restaurant, with that box of pastries and those eyes that would not lower, I knew I was in trouble. I am not good at talking about feelings. I have never had to speak about this because there has never been this. But I know what I want, and I want you. Celeste set the cloth down on the table. Her hands trembled a little, and she hid it by gripping the edge of the table. But she knew Reed saw because he saw everything. She did not step back, did not turn her face away, did not say, "Give me time to think," or "I do not know." She had already thought. She had thought about this every night since he sat in the kitchen and told her about the piece of cake on the paper plate outside the orphanage room. She already had an answer, but the answer was not as simple as yes or no. "I feel something for you too, Reed," Celeste said, her voice calm but soft, like someone trying to keep her balance on a narrow wire. "I will not stand here and lie and say I do not. I tried. I tried to tell myself it was gratitude, loneliness, that you were the first person in this city who had been kind to me. But it is not. It is more than that, and I know it is more than that." She paused, drew in a breath, then continued. And this time her voice grew firmer, not with anger, but because she was saying the most important thing she needed him to hear clearly. "I am afraid, Reed. Not afraid of you. You have never made me afraid. I am afraid of the world you live in. I saw that alley. I saw the faces of the men being dragged from the car. I have seen the way this whole city speaks your name. I cannot love a man if every night I do not know whether he is coming home. I lost my mother. I lost my grandmother. I lost my father before I was even old enough to understand what loss meant. I cannot bear losing one more person, especially someone I choose to love. She looked directly into his eyes. If you want to have me, you have to find a way out of that world. I am not forcing a timetable. I am not telling you it must be tomorrow or next month. But that is my line, Reed. I will not step across that threshold while you are still standing on the other side of it. Reed said nothing. Celeste waited. She was used to his silence, but this silence was different. It was not the silence of a man in control. It was the silence of a man trying to absorb something too heavy to take in quickly. He looked at her, his gray eyes unblinking, and Celeste could see inside them a battle whose noise she could not hear. He was weighing something far greater than his answer to her. He was weighing his whole life, everything he had built, everything he was, placing it on one side of the scale, and on the other side was her, a woman who baked pastries with a worn recipe notebook. Then he nodded, one slow, heavy nod, as though his head had to move against the resistance of 20 years spent living only one way. He did not say, "All right," or "I will try," or "Give me time." He only nodded, and that nod said more than any promise he could have spoken aloud. It said that he knew she was right. It said that perhaps he had known for a long time but had never had a reason to do anything about it. And now he did. Celeste watched him nod, and her eyes began to sting. She did not cry. She had learned not to cry just as he had, only for different reasons. She released the edge of the table, stepped forward twice, then stopped. She did not hug him, did not touch him, not yet. She only stood closer, close enough for him to understand that she had not drawn that line in order to push him away, but because she wanted him to step toward her far enough that she might one day hold on. 2 weeks after the afternoon, Reed nodded in the bakery. Everything between them remained suspended. They knew each other's feelings, yet they had not touched, had not said more, had not made anything official. Reed still appeared in the kitchen on those early mornings, still set a cup of coffee at the corner of the table for Celeste. But he did not bring up that conversation again, and neither did she. They were in that stage where every glance carried meaning, yet neither of them translated it into words. Like two people standing on opposite banks of a river looking at one another, while neither had stepped into the water. Celeste poured herself into the bakery. Orders increased, and she had begun thinking about hiring help. The recipe notebook lay in the drawer beneath the front counter, and she opened it every day to read her grandmother's notes before she began baking. A small habit she kept the way one keeps a loved one near. Then that night happened. Fire. The bakery. 2 o'clock in the morning. Everything she had built over the past 4 months turned to ash in a single night. And the notebook. She had forgotten it in the drawer beneath the counter that evening, because she had closed in a rush to go home and prepare the order for the next morning. Now Celeste sat on the edge of the bed in the small room behind the mansion, her eyes swollen, her hands shaking, her clothes still carrying the smell of smoke. On the table before her lay the notebook. The cover was blackened, the edges singed, the worn spine now more worn from heat. Reed had placed it there 3 hours after the fire, when he came into her room without knocking, without speaking, only set the notebook on the table and stood there. At that moment Celeste had not had the strength to ask him where he found it, or how, or whether it had been dangerous. She had only looked at the notebook and cried. Now she had stopped crying. Her eyes were dry and burning, but her hands still trembled as she picked up the notebook and opened it. The first page, the recipe for classic vanilla butter cake, her grandmother's handwriting leaning slightly to the right, the blue ink faded with age, and in the margin the small note, "Add a little salt if the air is damp." The page was intact. Celeste turned to page 2, page 3, one page after another, checking every recipe, every note in the margins, every faint smudge of flour her grandmother had left behind. The paper was a little more brittle from the heat, and the smell of smoke had soaked into every sheet, but the writing was still legible, the notes still clear. Not a single page was missing. She turned to the last page, then closed the book and pressed it against her chest. She lifted her eyes to read. He was still standing where he had been, near the door, his back against the wall, his arms folded across his chest. There was soot on the sleeve of his shirt, and for the first time Celeste realized that he had gone into the burning bakery to retrieve that notebook. She did not know whether he went in before or after the firefighters. She did not know how long he had been inside. She only knew that he knew the notebook was kept in the drawer beneath the counter, because she had told him, on those early mornings in the kitchen, that she always kept it there so she could open it and read it every day. Who did this? Celeste asked, her voice hoarse and low. It was not a question born of curiosity, but because she needed to know. Her bakery had not caught fire by itself at 2 o'clock in the morning. Someone had done this on purpose, and she needed to know who, because she needed to understand how dangerous the world was that she was living inside. Reed looked at her. He did not answer at once. His jaw tightened, the muscle at his temple jumped once, and in his gray eyes Celeste saw something she had never seen before, colder than ever, deeper than ever, like the surface of a lake freezing over again, after it had cracked open the night he told her about the orphanage. He did not say, "I will find out." He made no promise. He gave no explanation. But the way he looked at her, the way his jaw tightened, the way his folded arms drew tighter than usual told her everything. He would find out. And whoever had done this would pay. Celeste set the notebook down on the table. She rose from the bed, crossed the small room, and hugged Reed. She wrapped both arms around his waist, pressed her face against his chest, and held him tightly. This was the first time she had touched him, not in a handshake, not by brushing his shoulder and passing in the kitchen, not by laying her hand on his the night he told her about the orphanage. This was her embracing him, deliberately, completely, because she needed to hold someone, and the only person she wanted to hold at that moment was him. Reed stood still. 1 second, 2 seconds. His body was rigid, his arms still folded, like a man who did not know what to do when someone held him, because no one in his life had ever held him this way. Then he lowered his arms slowly and placed them on her back, one hand in the middle of her back, the other behind her head, and he held her in return, gently at first, then more tightly, like a man who had just found something he had not even known he had been searching for. For the first time in his life, Reed Calloway held another person not out of duty, not because of a transaction, not because someone needed his protection. He held her because he wanted to, and that wanting was greater than anything he had ever wanted in his 33 years of living. They stood that way in the small room, the smell of smoke still clinging to Celeste's clothes, soot still marking Reed's sleeve, the blackened notebook lying on the table, and outside the window the sky was beginning to lighten. No one said a word. The next day Reed began his investigation. Celeste did not know the details. She only knew that he disappeared for 3 full days, did not come to the restaurant kitchen, did not appear at the mansion. Margot said, "He is handling it," her voice calm, though her eyes were not calm at all. Celeste waited. She had no bakery to go to anymore, so she sat in her room, wiping each page of the notebook with a damp cloth, laying them out on the table to dry, and waiting. On the 4th day, Reed returned. Celeste was sitting in the mansion kitchen drinking tea with Margot when he walked in. He looked at Celeste, then at Margot, and Margot understood at once. She rose, picked up her teacup, said, "I am going to water the plants," then left the kitchen and closed the door behind her. Reed sat down in the chair Margot had just vacated. He placed both hands on the table, his fingers laced together. Celeste looked at his face and saw something broken there. Not anger, not coldness, but pain. The kind of pain that belongs to a man who has just discovered that the knife in his back was held by the hand he trusted most. "I found out," Reed said, his voice low and dry, with no feeling allowed to pass through it. Celeste set down her teacup. "Who?" Reed looked at her, and when he spoke the name, Celeste saw his jaw tighten as if he were biting through each syllable. The man who had followed him for 10 years, his closest lieutenant, the same man she had seen in passing at the mansion once or twice, nodding to her in greeting whenever he walked by, and someone Celeste had never once thought about. The next morning, Celeste sat at the kitchen table in the mansion, with the notebook open before her. She took a damp cloth, wrung it out carefully, and wiped each page one by one. Slow, gentle, each stroke of the cloth moving down the length of the paper, careful not to let the water bleed into the ink. After each page was cleaned, she laid it flat on the table to dry, weighing down the corners with teacups so the paper would not curl. Reed sat in the chair across from her, silent, watching her work. He did not help. He did not ask questions. He did not speak. He only sat there, and his presence in the quiet morning kitchen was enough. Early sunlight came through the window and fell across the pages spread out to dry on the table, and for a few minutes, everything felt peaceful enough that Celeste almost forgot her bakery was now nothing more than blackened brick and ash. Then Reed stood. He looked at Celeste, gave a small nod, and stepped out of the kitchen. Celeste heard his car start and leave the mansion. She knew where he was going. She knew because she had seen his face the night before when he spoke the name of his lieutenant, and she knew that today was the day he would face the man who had betrayed him. Reed drove to his private office in the old district on the eastern side of Ashford. The office was on the second floor of a building he owned, the place from which he managed everything belonging to the part of his life he kept hidden behind the polished front of Callaway Holdings. He summoned his lieutenant. He gave no reason, only told him to come at once. The man arrived within 15 minutes. His name was one Reed had spoken thousands of times over the last 10 years, during late-night meetings, in difficult decisions, in those moments when he needed someone he believed he could trust, standing at his back. The man had been the first one Reed recruited when he began building everything, the only one who knew the code to the office safe. The man to whom Reed had entrusted a key to the mansion in case of emergency. 10 years. He walked into the office, closed the door, and sat down in the chair across from Reed's desk, as he had done hundreds of times before. Reed did not ask him to sit. He sat on his own because he was used to it. He looked at Reed, and Celeste would never know this, but in that instant, he knew. He looked into Reed's eyes and understood that Reed knew. 10 years of reading each other's faces had taught him enough that Reed did not have to say the words first. Reed sat behind the desk, both hands resting on the wood, fingers laced together. He looked at the man, and he did not shout. Reed Callaway never shouted. He did not need to, because his voice, when lowered, was more frightening than any raised one could ever be. He spoke, each word clear, each word heavy as though he were hammering nails into a coffin. 10 years. For 10 years I trusted you more than anyone. You were the only man with a key to my house. You were the only man who knew what floor I slept on. 10 years. And you used those 10 years to do this. The lieutenant sat in the chair, his back still straight, his eyes fixed on Reed. He did not deny it. He knew denial meant nothing to a man who had found the truth before calling him in. He sat silent for a moment, then he spoke, his voice so calm it was almost cold. The voice of a man who believed he was right, even while knowing he was about to lose everything. She will destroy everything you built. He said it plainly. You are changing, Reed. Ever since she came, you have grown softer. You have grown slower. You have started thinking about things a man in your position is not allowed to think about. I did this not because I hate her. I did it because if you keep going this way, in 6 months there will be nothing left to build. Reed listened to the last sentence, and then a heavy silence fell across the office. Celeste would never know this moment, but it was the moment Reed looked at the man who had stood beside him for 10 years, the man he had trusted more than anyone in the world, and understood that this trust had been used to burn down the bakery of the woman he loved. She is the only reason I want to build something instead of destroy it, Reed said, his voice so low it was nearly a whisper, but every word cut through the air like a blade. You say she is making me soft. You are right. She is making me soft, and that is the best thing that has ever happened to me in all my 33 years of living. You do not understand that because no one has ever made you want to become soft. Reed rose to his feet. He gave the man no chance to say more. He spoke briefly, and every sentence was like a door slamming shut. The man lost his position, lost all access to Reed's systems, lost every business relationship Reed had built for him over the past 10 years. Accounts frozen, keys revoked, phone number erased. When he walked out of that office, he would have nothing left. Not because Reed had taken everything, but because everything he had ever had was built on the foundation of Reed's trust, and that foundation had just collapsed. Reed did not strike him. He did not need to. What he took away hurt more than any blow ever could, the man's very existence inside the world he had lived in for 10 years. The lieutenant stood. He looked at Reed one last time. And in that moment, though Celeste would never know it, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like regret. Not regret for losing money or status, but regret because he knew he had just lost the only man who had ever truly believed in him. Then he turned, walked out the door, and closed it behind him. Reed remained in the office, alone. The room was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sounds of cars below the closed window. He sat behind the desk, both hands still resting on the wood, looking at the empty chair across from him where that lieutenant had sat 10 years before, almost every day for 10 years, and now it was empty. Reed Callaway had lost many things in his life. He had lost his mother before he ever knew her face. He had lost his childhood in foster care. He had lost the ability to cry at 10 years old. But that night, sitting alone in the dark office and looking at the empty chair, he felt a different kind of loss for the first time. Not the loss of money, not the loss of power, the loss of trust, the loss of the person he had believed would never betray him, and that emptiness was hollow in a way nothing could fill. He sat there for a very long time. Then he thought of Celeste, of his nod in the bakery that afternoon, of the line she had drawn, of the words she had said, that if he wanted to have her, he had to find a way out of that world. He looked around the office, looked at the empty chair, looked at the walls, looked at the entire empire he had built since walking out of foster care at 16, with nothing but his bare hands, and for the first time in his life, he knew with certainty, not thought, not considered, but knew with certainty, that he had to leave this world. Not because Celeste had forced him, but because the man he trusted most in that world had just burned down the bakery of the woman he loved most outside it. And he no longer wanted to live in a place where those two things could not exist together. The week after the night, Reed sat alone in the dark office, staring at the empty chair. Workers began appearing at the old location of Celeste's bakery. They tore out the burned brick, scraped away the blackened walls, and ran new pipes through the building. Celeste came to see it on the first day and stood on the sidewalk looking inside, at the place where she had once scrubbed every floor tile by hand, and which was now nothing but a stripped skeleton. She asked Reed who was paying to rebuild it. He told her the building was his, and repairing his own building was the responsibility of the owner, which had nothing to do with her. Celeste knew that was his way of saying I am paying for it without making her feel indebted, and she also knew that technically he was right. The building was his property, the insurance on it was his, and the repairs were his obligation as the owner. But she still kept track of it in her mind, because Celeste was the kind of woman who counted every dollar and never forgot who had spent money on her for anything. 6 weeks later, the new bakery was finished. It was larger than the old one, with a wider storefront, and the kitchen in the back had been redesigned with 2 industrial ovens instead of 1, a longer stainless steel table, and a separate cold storage room for ingredients. Celeste stepped inside on the first day, walked from the register counter to the kitchen and back again, her hand gliding over the new surfaces, opening every drawer, checking every oven. She placed her recipe notebook in the drawer beneath the register, exactly where it had always been, and when she closed the drawer, her chest felt lighter than it had at any time since the night of the fire. Reed brought her the new lease agreement. Celeste read it and saw that the rent was still the same amount she herself had raised it to before, $2,500. He did not lower it even though the bakery had just been burned by one of his own. She signed. He signed. Neither of them mentioned a discount or compensation. When the new bakery opened, customers came back almost immediately. Many people had heard about the fire, and in a town like Ashford, bad news traveled fast, but sympathy traveled just as fast. Celeste hired 2 young women, one to help at the front counter and one to help with baking in the kitchen. She began teaching them the recipes from her grandmother's notebook, step by step, detail by detail, exactly the way her grandmother had taught her when she was 7 years old. She opened the notebook and laid it on the stainless steel table in the center of the kitchen, showing them every margin note. Add salt if the air is damp, reduce the sugar if the butter is salted. Always let the dough rest 10 minutes before kneading it the final time. She saw more of her grandmother in herself than ever before, standing in the kitchen, passing down what had once been passed down to her, and she understood that the notebook was not only a collection of recipes, it was the way her grandmother kept living on through Celeste's hands, and through the hands of the people she taught. In the 3rd month after the new bakery opened, one afternoon after closing time, Celeste drove to the mansion. She went into the kitchen, where Reed was sitting and reading papers. She placed a white envelope on the table in front of him. Reed looked at the envelope, then at her. He opened it. Inside was cash, the full $14,000. He counted it, and nothing was missing. He looked at her for a long moment, then folded the envelope and slipped it into the inner pocket of his shirt without saying a word. Celeste said nothing either. She turned and walked out, and as she passed through the doorway, she felt lighter than $14,000. Not because of the money, but because she no longer owed anyone in this world anything at all. Everything she had from that moment on was hers, earned by her, built by her. Then came that morning. 5 o'clock. The restaurant kitchen. Celeste had arrived first, turned on the lights, opened the ovens, and laid out the ingredients. She was kneading dough, her hands pressing into the soft mass with the familiar rhythm she knew so well, when the back door opened. Reed stepped in carrying 2 cups of coffee, just as he did every morning. He placed 1 cup at the corner of the table near Celeste, exactly where he always set it. Then he placed something else beside the coffee, a small box, smaller than the palm of a hand, wrapped in black velvet. Celeste looked at the box. Her hands stopped kneading, dough still clinging to her fingers. She looked at the coffee, then the box, then lifted her eyes. Reed stood across from her, about 2 steps away, his hands not in his pockets, his shoulders leaning against nothing. He stood straight, looking at her, and there was none of the cold confidence on his face that she had grown used to seeing. He looked like a man who had placed everything he had on the table and was waiting for the other person to decide. He did not kneel. He did not launch into some long speech he had prepared in advance. He only stood there in the empty restaurant kitchen at 5 in the morning and said, "I do not know how to propose the right way. I have never done this before, and I do not know what men are supposed to say. But I do know that I do not come here every morning because of the coffee." Celeste looked at him. Her eyes burned, her throat tightened, but she did not cry. She reached out, picked up the box, and opened it. Inside was a ring. Simple. Not a huge diamond or some elaborate design, only a white gold band with a small blue stone set at the center. Beautiful in exactly the way Celeste loved. Not flashy, not loud, only enough. She took out the ring and slipped it onto the ring finger of her left hand. It fit perfectly, though she had no idea how Reed had known her size. Her fingers were still dusted with flour, and some of it clung to the ring, white against white gold. "I do not come here every morning because of flour either," Celeste said. And then the laughter rose out of her chest, the very same laughter from the morning she had handed him the flowered apron and told him to knead. The laughter Reed had fallen in love with from the first instant he heard it ringing through the empty kitchen while flour streaked his face. Reed stepped closer. He lifted a hand and touched her cheek, his fingers brushing the streak of flour there. Then he bent and kissed her. Gently, slowly. His mouth was warm and tasted of coffee, and Celeste closed her eyes, laid both hands against his chest, leaving white flour prints on his black shirt, and kissed him back. Their first kiss happened in the empty restaurant kitchen at 5 in the morning, with the smell of flour mingling with coffee, bright fluorescent lights above them. No music, no candles, nothing except 2 people who had gone through far too much to arrive at this moment. And this moment, though it was not perfect in the way anyone might imagine a proposal should be, was perfect in the way that belonged only to them, because it was real, because it was them. They held the wedding 6 weeks after that morning in the restaurant kitchen. Celeste did not want anything large, and Reed did not want anything large either, so they agreed with each other almost without needing to discuss it. No grand church, no reception for 100 guests, no invitations stamped in gold, only a small ceremony in the back garden of the mansion, beneath the branches of the old oak tree that Margot had watered every morning for 8 years. The guests could be counted on 2 hands. Margot, the 2 young women who worked in the bakery, a few people close to Reed whom Celeste had met a few times at the mansion, and an elderly pastor, the same man who had once let Celeste borrow the church kitchen when she first arrived in Ashford. When Celeste invited him, he looked at her and smiled, and said that he had known from the night she stood in the church kitchen baking until 2 o'clock in the morning that she was a woman who would be all right. He just had not expected all right to come so quickly. Celeste wore a simple white dress, no long train, no lace covering everything, no glitter. She bought white fabric from the fabric shop on the main street and cut it and sewed it herself, because she knew how to sew, and because she wanted this dress to be made by her own hands, just like everything else she had in Ashford. But she added one detail. In the small suitcase she had brought from her old city, there was an old tablecloth that had belonged to her grandmother, white lace yellowed by time, its edges frayed, yet the lace pattern still beautiful, the kind of pattern people no longer weave anymore. Celeste cut a strip of lace from the edge of the cloth, carefully, 1 line of scissors at a time, then stitched that lace trim into the sleeves of her wedding dress. When she slipped on the ring during the ceremony, the lace from her grandmother's tablecloth rested right beside the silver ring Reed had placed next to a cup of coffee in the restaurant kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning. Her grandmother was there, in her own way, through every thread of lace she had woven by hand so many decades ago. Reed wore a black suit and a white shirt, without a tie. He stood beneath the oak tree waiting for Celeste to step out through the back door of the mansion, and when he saw her, everyone present witnessed something almost no one had ever seen before. Reed Calloway smiled. Not the slight lift at the corner of his mouth that Celeste had started to grow used to. Not the nod accompanied by a gaze a little warmer than usual. He truly smiled, his mouth opening, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time Margot saw his eyes smile too. She stood in the front row holding a handkerchief, and she began to cry at that exact moment, before the pastor had even spoken. The ceremony was short. The elderly pastor said a few words about love and patience, about two people from different worlds finding each other in a place no one would have expected. Reed spoke his vows first, his voice low and even but not cold, each word heavy and slow, like a man not accustomed to saying such things, yet trying with all his strength because the woman standing before him deserved to hear them. Celeste spoke her vows after him, her voice trembling on the first sentence but growing steadier, and when she finished, she looked straight into Reed's eyes without blinking, and he looked back at her without blinking, and between them was the distance of a single step that had taken them 4 months to cross. They exchanged rings. Reed placed the ring on Celeste's hand, and she placed the ring on his, a plain silver band she had bought with money earned from the bakery, because she wanted the ring he wore to be something she had bought herself, not something he had bought for himself. Reed looked at the ring on his hand and turned it slightly, and Celeste saw something change in his eyes for one quick instant. Exactly like the 3 silent seconds when he tasted her first pastry outside the restaurant so many months earlier, and then it was gone. Margot cried through the entire ceremony. When Celeste went to hug her after the pastor made the announcement, Margot held her hand, her eyes red, her voice trembling. "These are not tears of joy," she said. "These are tears of relief. I have been waiting for this day for a long time. For 8 years I have lived in that house, watching him live alone, eat alone, sit alone, in the dark living room every night. I knew he needed someone, but I did not know who that someone was. Now I do." Celeste held her more tightly and said nothing, because she knew that if she opened her mouth she would cry, and she had promised herself that today she would laugh more than she cried. That evening, after everyone had gone home, after Margot had finished cleaning the garden and gone to bed, Reed and Celeste sat on the back steps of the mansion. The sky was dark, the breeze gentle, and insects sang in the garden. Reed sat beside her, his shoulder touching hers, and he spoke in a quiet voice meant only for her. "I will keep my promise. I have already begun, not finished yet, but begun. I will leave the old world. Not tomorrow, not next month, but I am moving." Celeste rested her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of him pass through the thin fabric onto her own shoulder. "I am not forcing time," she said, her voice soft and low in the darkness. "I only need to know that you are moving toward me." Reed did not answer with words. He reached over, took her hand, and sat in silence. The two of them sat on the steps late into the night, hand in hand, looking out over the dark yard where only a few hours earlier they had stood before each other and spoken their vows. The ring on Celeste's hand caught the hallway light and gave off a faint shimmer, and the strip of her grandmother's lace on her sleeve looked pale in the dark. She did not know what the future would look like. She did not know how long it would take Reed to leave the world he had lived in for half his life. She did not know whether the road ahead would be long or short or rough, but she knew that he was moving toward her. And for Celeste, who had driven her old car into Ashford with $47 and a box of pastries, knowing that someone was moving toward her was enough. Reed began the process of leaving his old world 3 weeks after the wedding. He did not tell Celeste the details, and she did not ask, because by then they understood each other well enough to know that there were things he had to handle on his own and things she did not need to know. But Celeste noticed the change through small signs. Reed began coming home later, not late in the old way when he would disappear all night and then appear in the kitchen at dawn with a cup of coffee, but late in the way of a man buried in long meetings, tense negotiations, and phone calls that stretched past midnight. There were deeper shadows beneath his eyes, more strain held across his shoulders, and sometimes when he sat at the dinner table, Celeste would catch him staring into the empty space ahead of him with the eyes of a man calculating 10 moves at once. What Celeste did not know, and what Reed never told her, was that leaving the underworld was nothing like resigning from an ordinary company. There was no letter of resignation, no farewell dinner, no 2 weeks' notice. Reed had built his empire over 17 years, from the time he walked out of foster care at 16, and that empire had become a complicated network of people, money, power, and quiet agreements that no one wanted to see broken. He could not simply walk away, because walking away would mean leaving a vacuum of power, And in that world, a vacuum never stayed empty for long. Someone would fill it, and that someone might not have the lines Reed had. So Reed chose another way. He did not walk out. He negotiated. He met with each partner, each man under him, each link in the network, and he made an offer. He transferred control to an alliance of the 5 largest partners, dividing it evenly so that no one man held everything alone and they would keep each other in balance, instead of depending on him. In return, he kept all the legitimate assets, the restaurants, the hotels, the real estate, and one single condition that could not be negotiated. No one was to touch his family. Not anyone. Not at any time. Not even after Reed was gone. This was not kindness. This was a business arrangement. Reed was selling what those 5 men wanted most, power, and he was buying what he wanted most, freedom. Not all of them agreed easily. One of the 5 partners believed Reed was growing weak, that he had allowed a woman to change him, and that if he was leaving, then the agreement ought to tilt further in their favor. Reed met that man alone one evening. They spoke for 3 hours, and when the meeting ended, the man agreed to every original condition, without changing so much as a comma. Celeste never knew what Reed had said during those 3 hours, and she did not ask. She only knew that he came home that night with a weariness deeper than usual, though his shoulders looked a little less tight. Throughout that entire process, Celeste did one simple thing. Every night, no matter how late Reed came home, she left the kitchen light on. Not the living room light, not the hallway light, but the kitchen light, because the kitchen was where they had begun. She cooked dinner, set aside a portion for him on the table, covered it, and went to bed. She did not sit up waiting, did not call to ask where he was, did not send messages. She simply left the light on and left his meal waiting, and that was how she said, "I am waiting for you to come home," without opening her mouth. Reed knew, because every morning when Celeste woke, the plate had been emptied, washed, and left to dry on the rack, and the kitchen light had been turned off. The process lasted 4 months. 4 months of late-night meetings, tense phone calls, nights when Reed came home with the smell of other people's cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket, though he did not smoke. 4 months in which Celeste watched her husband grow thinner, quieter, deeper in the eyes. But she also saw him growing lighter, like a man taking off one heavy layer of armor after another, armor he had worn for 20 years. Every meeting that ended was another layer stripped away, and beneath that armor was the man Celeste had first seen in the restaurant kitchen at 5 a.m, when he told her about the piece of cake on the paper plate outside the orphanage room. Then, one night, near the end of the 4th month, Reed came home later than ever before. Celeste had gone to sleep at 11. The kitchen light was still on. His meal was still on the table, covered. Reed stepped into the house, took off his shoes at the door, walked through the dark hallway, and entered the kitchen. He sat down in the chair, and before him was the plate of food Celeste had left for him, with a silver fork resting on a paper napkin beside it, and a glass of water next to that. Just like every other night. Exactly like every other night for 4 months. But tonight was different. Tonight was the night the final meeting had ended. The deal was complete. The papers were signed. The power had been transferred. Reed Calloway, as of midnight tonight, was officially no longer the boss of anything except a chain of restaurants, a few buildings, and a bakery his wife rested for $2,500 a month. Reed sat there looking at the meal. He looked at the fork resting on the napkin. He looked at the glass of water. He looked at the warm kitchen light spilling across the wooden table, and he thought that for 4 months now, every night he came home, the first thing he saw was the kitchen light glowing, and the first thing he knew was that Celeste was here, in this house, waiting for him. Not with words, not with questions, only with one light left on and one meal left for him. Reed Calloway, the man whose name the whole city of Ashford did not dare speak after 10 o'clock at night, the man who had taught himself not to cry at 10 years old because crying did not change anything, sat alone in his own kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning, looking at the meal his wife had left for him, and cried. The tears ran silently down his face. He did not wipe them away. He did not lower his head. He only sat there, the tears falling onto the tabletop, and he cried because for the first time in his life, he had something more frightening to lose than his own life. For the first time in his life, he had a home with a kitchen light left on waiting for him. For the first time in his life, he had someone who saved him a plate of food every night without asking why he was late. And for the first time, after 33 years, he was free. Upstairs, Celeste lay in bed and heard her husband's footsteps in the kitchen below. She did not go downstairs. She knew there are moments when a person needs to be alone, and tonight was one of those moments for Reed. She lay still, closed her eyes, and listened to the silence beneath her, knowing he was sitting there, knowing he was eating the food she had cooked, knowing the kitchen light was still on, and she smiled in the dark because she knew he had come home. 1 year after the night Reed sat crying in the kitchen in front of the plate of food his wife had left for him, Celeste told him that she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, in the restaurant kitchen, at 5 o'clock, just after he had set a cup of coffee on the table for her as he did every day. She was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour, and she said it in an ordinary voice, as though she were reading a recipe. "You are going to be a father." Reed set his own coffee cup down on the table, slowly, then sat down in the corner chair, slowly, then looked at her, slowly. He said nothing for nearly half a minute. Celeste stopped kneading and looked at him, and she saw an expression on his face that she had never seen before. Not coldness, not control, not the softness that came over him when he watched her laugh, but fear. Reed Calloway, the man who had survived foster care, survived the underworld, survived 17 years living on the fear of other people, was now sitting in the chair in the restaurant kitchen and afraid. Afraid because he was about to become responsible for a small, fragile life he did not know how to care for, because no one had ever cared for him properly enough for him to learn how. 9 months later, their first child came into the world on an early spring morning. Celeste lay in the hospital bed, exhausted but bright-eyed, and the nurse placed the baby into her arms. She held the child and looked at that tiny sleeping face, and she felt that her grandmother's recipe notebook, her grandmother's hands, the scent of the kitchen, the smell of melting butter, all of it was coming alive again inside her in that moment, because she was holding the next generation in her arms, the one she would teach to bake, the one she would tell about her grandmother, the one she would love in the same way her grandmother had loved her. Then Celeste looked at Reed. He was standing beside the bed, looking at the baby, and he did not touch. He stood there with his hands hanging at his sides, staring at his child with wide gray eyes, and Celeste could see that he wanted to hold the baby but did not dare. She lifted the baby toward him. "Take your child." Reed looked at her, looked at the baby, then held out his hands. Large hands, hands the whole city of Ashford had once feared, hands he had used to build an empire from the age of 16, hands he had slammed down on tables in negotiations no one dared argue with. Those hands trembled when he took the baby from Celeste, trembled when he settled the child into his arms, trembled when he touched one finger to the baby's cheek, so lightly it was almost not a touch at all, because he was afraid of being too rough, afraid of doing it wrong, afraid these hands did not know how to be gentle. Celeste watched that sight, and her eyes filled. "You won't do it wrong," she said, her voice soft and warm. "You have been doing it right since the day you chose to turn toward me." Reed looked down at the baby, looked at the closed eyes, the tiny nose, the hand smaller than his thumb, and he held the child a little more securely, just enough, not too tight, not too loose, exactly the way Celeste knew he would find, because he always found the right way when he truly wanted to. Many years later, Celeste's Bakery became the most beloved name in Ashford, not because of advertising, not because of money, but because every pastry that left that bakery carried with it the recipe of a grandmother who had taught her granddaughter to bake at the age of 7, and that granddaughter had carried the recipes through 4 months of wandering, through a fire, through love, through everything, until at last she could pass them on to others. Celeste opened free vocational classes for women in hardship, women like the one she had once been, women who came to Ashford with empty pockets and hearts full of hope, and she taught them not only how to bake, but also that their hands were worth more than they believed. Reed established a charitable foundation for orphan children, because he knew what it felt like to grow up unwanted, and he wanted those children to know that someone did want them. They had 3 children, and the great mansion where Margot had watered the plants every morning for so many years now rang with the laughter of children, and Margot, now well into her 70s, was still there, still brewing tea every morning, still the only person who dared speak plainly to Reed, though now she spoke just as plainly to all 3 children as well. Her grandmother's recipe notebook now rested in a glass case inside the bakery, right beside the register, where customers could see it every time they walked in. The cover was blackened by smoke, the edges scorched, the spine worn, but inside every page remained intact, the handwriting leaning slightly to the right, the faint traces of flour left by her grandmother's hands more than 20 years earlier. On the first page, Above the recipe for the classic vanilla butter cake, there was now one new line written by hand in blue ink. In Celeste's own script, "Grandmother taught me how to bake, but life taught me that the most important recipe is not written in this book." If this story touched you, please press like and share it so that more people can hear it. We would love to know how you felt after hearing this story and which moment moved you the most. So please write in the comments and let us hear what came from the deepest part of your heart. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel so that you will not miss the new stories we share each week. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.